So you know that stereotype of girls with their girlfriends when one of the gang meets that special somebody, how they all get together and talk in really high squeaky voices and say things like, oh my gosh, what is he like? Or does he look good in jeans? Or what color is his hair? Now, honestly, I have no idea what those actual conversations look like, but I know that there's a stereotype, and I don't know if it's true or not. But I also know that guys actually also do the same thing when they're hanging out with their guy friends. Usually we try to like subdue our emotions and be more cool when we ask about it, but because we care about our friends, we want to know what that special somebody is like when they meet them. So a few years ago, one of my best friends, Chris, started to date a girl, Erin. And he, one night when me and Chris and a couple of our other best friends were all together playing video games, he started to tell us that he was dating Erin, that it was getting really serious, and that they really liked each other. And so, like you do, we asked Chris, Chris, tell us what she's like. And Chris, he answered us, but he wasn't giving us the answers that we were looking for. He would say things like, well, she's a great musician and she plays the cello, or she's really smart, or she wants to be a teacher when she graduates. And while those are details about her life that are important, they weren't the kind of answers that we were looking for. So finally we told Chris, hey, stop giving us her resume. Tell us what she's like. Is she funny? Does she like to spend time with you? Does she enjoy long walks on the beach? What is her character like? Does she have a good sense of humor? We aren't as interested in what she looks like on paper as what she's like in person. And do you like her? So why do I mention this? Well, honestly, I think that this is actually something that we tend to do when we think and talk about God, right? So what is God like? You know, I think that's easily one of the most important questions of the most important questions. Like, it's the top tier of the important questions that human beings ask and answer in their lives, right? So is God a he? Is God a she? Is God an it? Is he a they? Is there one God? Are there many? Is he an old man in the sky with a beard? Or is he kind of like an invisible force? Am I God? Are you God? Or is God separate from creation, right? Does God care about what's going on in the world? Or is he distant and far away? What is God like? It's such an important question. So A.W. Tozer, who's a theologian and author from the middle of the last century, said this: what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And I have to agree with that. What you think about God, what he's like, what he wants, what he does or doesn't do in the world will define how you live. If you think about it, if you think of God as an angry, like he's angry with you, he's angry with the world, that he's constantly watching out and watching after you, and he's ready to zap you if you do something wrong, if you think that that's what God is like, it will shape you into a certain kind of person, probably into a self-righteous jerk who's very concerned with your own behavior and with everybody else's, and you'll look down your nose at anybody who doesn't live up to some standard. Or if you think that God is like a cosmic vending machine, like a kind of genie in a bottle who lives to fulfill your deepest desires, and his most important desire is to make sure that you're happy in life, that will shape you into a kind of person. Probably a very self-centered jerk who believes that God blesses whatever you do as long as it makes you happy, right? And even if you don't believe in God and the supernatural, it will shape you. I don't know if you've ever noticed that many atheists, it seems like they're furious with a God that they don't even believe in. So as far back as we can look into the past, human beings have been trying to reckon with the supernatural, with God. And every culture that has ever existed has offered us ideas about what they think God looks like. And a very popular thing to say in our increasingly progressive culture is, well, it's silly to think that any one culture or religion could capture the idea of God. How can you think that you are right and that every other culture and religion in the world is wrong? Probably every culture and religion in the world has some small piece of the puzzle right, but nobody can see the whole picture. And for what it's worth, I think that's an excellent argument for the skeptical approach to God. I mean, you probably wondered the same thing. Like, how do I know that my view or my religion's view of God is right and correct? And maybe more importantly, how do I know that everybody else in the world is wrong, right? And I think that's a good question. How could we possibly know? Well, Honestly, I think that the answer is really simple. What if God came down and told us what he's like? What if the eternal God wrote himself into the human story and he himself describes himself? So you and I, as believers in the one true God, we believe that God did write himself into our story, that God entered into the world, and from the beginning of the scriptures, he's been telling us what he's like. So the story of the Bible is the story of a God who, over a very long period of time, is revealing himself to us and to the world. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to zero in on one of those pivotal scriptures in the Bible where God reveals himself to his people. But it's interesting. I think for many of us that we would answer the question, what is God like? We'd answer it very differently from how God himself actually answers that question. We tend to be more like my friend Chris, giving God's resumes, listing his attributes. When a lot of us talk about what God is like, we start to sound really Western and philosophical, right? So we say things like God is omnipresent, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, right? He's all knowing, he's all powerful, and he's everywhere present all at once. Or we say things like, well, God is a Trinity. He is one God, but three persons in one God, right? And hear me say this, all of those things are important and helpful things for us to know about God, but it's interesting that that's actually not how God chooses to describe himself when his creatures ask him what he's like. God's description of himself doesn't sound like a theology textbook. He doesn't say, well, I'm omnipresent. That means I see you when you're sleeping and I know when you're awake, right? So actually, God's description of himself sounds something like this. So in the book of Exodus, after God has brought his people out of Egypt, he meets with them on Mount Sinai where God binds himself to his people in a special covenant relationship. But almost immediately, the people fail miserably, choosing to worship an image of God rather than God himself, right? Remember the golden calf? But God won't give up on his people. He shows them grace and mercy, and in the midst of remaking the covenant between God and people and repairing that relationship, Moses says to God in Exodus 33, verse 13, "If I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight." So Moses wants to know what God does in order that he might please God. And then in verse 18 he says this, "Please show me your glory." Right, so Moses is trying to get a better picture of God. He's in this really unique relationship with God, and he wants to know more about him, right? And God says no, right? So God says no to his questions. Instead, in verse 19, he says, "I will make all of my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you the name of the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Okay, and so then in Exodus 34, verse 5, after Moses has cut the new tablets for the new terms of the covenant, right? God is going to go in and write the 10 Commandments again after Moses broke them after the golden calf incident. In Exodus 34, verse 5, it says this, "The Lord descended in a cloud and stood with him there," Moses, "and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation." And Moses quickly bowed his head to the earth and worshipped. So a lot going on there. But did you see it? Did you see how God answers Moses' question? When Moses says, "Show me your ways, show me your glories," God answers him by talking about his name and his character. Something really incredible going on there. So studying God isn't like studying anything else that you might study in school, right? God isn't a frog to be dissected. He's not a sentence to be diagrammed, right? God is a person, right? He's three persons, in fact. That's talk for another day, right? My point is that the God that we encounter in the scriptures is a personal being, and he's a personal being unlike any other. And yet, like you and me, he has a name and he wants us to know it. So in ancient cultures, so much more than in our modern cultures, names weren't just identifiers. They were your identity, right? So Becca and I just had our second baby, and we named him Judah Israel. And there's some special meaning in that name for us. But even more so, in ancient cultures, your name was extremely important because it was your identity. That's why you have God changing Abram's name, which meant exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of the multitude. Or why you have Jacob, whose name means deceiver, changed to Israel, which means God strives, or he strives with God. Maybe both. So in ancient cultures, your name is who you are, right? It's your identity. It speaks about who you are, what you're like, what you care about, and what you do. So, by the way, have you ever noticed that it's really difficult to have a deeper relationship with a person whose name you don't know? Like maybe somebody you've met like here and there, but you can't remember their name. And because you can't remember their name, it's like you can't have a conversation with them, right? You don't have a genuine connection with them until you know their name. And that's why in the next few weeks, we're going to move through these verses in detail where God proclaims his name to Moses. And we're going to see how God himself wants to be known, how God himself reveals himself. And I'm excited about these set of verses because they are so important to us today. But not just to us. Like ever since this has been written, God's people have been wrestling with it, quoting it, interpreting it, singing about it. Like, as a matter of fact, these verses are arguably the most quoted and alluded to verses in the scriptures, period. Right? So from the time they were written, we think by Moses, all the way through scriptures, biblical writers have been grappling with what does it mean that God is these things, that God chose to reveal himself as these things. So they're incredibly important. But what I want to leave you with today is just something really simple to think about. And it's the fact that God has a name and that he wants you to know it. Spend some time thinking about that this week because he wants us to know it, he wants us to know what he's like. Because he wants to be in a relationship with us. And that's why the question of what we think about God is so important. So, over the next couple of weeks, I want you to be thinking of these questions and asking them in your mind because I think it'll open up some new possibilities for us as we read these verses together over the next couple of weeks and consider them in detail. And my first question is the one that we started with. What do you think about when you think about God? Right? What comes to mind when I say, who is God? What is he like? How would you answer that question? What do you think that God is like? What does he care about? What does he do in the world? And what thoughts and feelings come to your mind when I say God? Secondly, how does your understanding of what God is like, what he does, and what he cares about shape you as a person? Right? We know that our thoughts about what God is like, they ultimately shape who we are and what we do. And lastly, how do these verses point us forward to Jesus? Right? Because the God who revealed himself at Sinai to Moses as these things, right? The Lord who's compassionate and gracious, who forgives sin and yet will not let the guilty get away with their sin, right? That weird tension that we have there. The God who reveals himself to Moses as these things is the same God who reveals himself to us in the person of Jesus Christ. Wrestle with that. Think about those things these next couple of days, and then we'll pick it up talking about the first couple of words in those verses this next week. So, blessings, my friends. I miss you, but I'm looking forward to getting to see you soon, and especially so that you can meet my second boy, Judah. He's excited to meet you too. Bye, guys.